Hey everybody, how are you?
Hello, hello.
Hello.
All right, we'll give it a few minutes.
Sounds excellent.
Hello.
Hey Jeremy, I can hear you.
Awesome.
So did folks have an enjoyable KubeCon experience this go around?
I thought it was pretty cool from the West Coast. It was a little early.
It's definitely on the early side. I have a very early schedule, so like our slot was the time that I would be like awake and alert anyway. But I think even for the East Coast, like a lot of that stuff would have been super, super early. And I can't even imagine West Coast.
Yeah, if I was on the East Coast, I think it would have been somewhat normal for me. But yeah, this was a bit of a stretch.
All right. Well, maybe we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to the May 11th, 2021 meeting of Kubernetes SIG Multicluster. Laura, I think you are on the agenda first, unless my eyes deceive me because I'm looking at the agenda right now.
No, I think you're right. I'm going to share my screen. Um, okay. Hopefully you all can see my slides. Basically, I wanted to check back in on some of the topics that came up from 2 weeks ago now. Slide over to here. We were discussing the MCS API's alpha to beta graduation criteria, making sure we were all still on the same page about it. So a couple things came up then. So I want to just deep dive more into those. I'm going to highlight here, it's in red, but here I've also highlighted it that my goal is to discuss those topics that we brought up last time. And in particular, I want to determine if they're blockers to beta graduation. So if we still need to talk about them more, but they're not blockers to beta graduation, I'm interested to know that because I definitely want to know what like the specific blockers are for beta right now. So just for prioritization purposes. So the things I want to talk about, the topics that are still open, is about the existing beta graduation point about kube proxy consuming service imports and service exports. Also talk a little bit about cluster ID, alpha beta GA timeline if we want to align those, and also what's the latest on the CRD bootstrapping project. And then there are a couple SIG network projects that we expect or came up last time we met that we think might interact with the MCS API some way, like that we need to adapt the MCS API to do what they do. So I did a little bit of research into where they stand right now, and we'll report a little bit on that for anybody else who doesn't already know. And then we can discuss whether those are relevant to beta graduation or kind of separate. So that's the schedule. So I want to open up with the topic that we tabled last time. In particular, since Jeremy is here, I know I had mentioned that he had some thoughts about this. So we had kind of tabled it to make sure he could be involved. So this line item, kubeproxy can consume service import and endpoint slice, is currently an alpha beta graduation item. But what I'm bringing the discussion up about, what I'm proposing is whether or not this should still be included. Is this a like restriction of the standard, or is it more of an implementation detail? And if so, does that mean that it doesn't need to be part of the beta graduation requirements for the API cap? So for example, the current implementations use dummy services to sort of get around the fact that kubeproxy can't interact with these directly. So it's still possible to implement MCS API without this. And there is one pro that if we don't include this, then the fully specified MCS API is not restricted by a cluster version. It's not restricted by a version of implementation of kubeproxy. So I'd like to open the floor to talk a little bit about that. Jeremy, maybe if you have more color to put on this too, since you had wanted to be part of the discussion.
Yeah, just kind of looking at where we're at and what's out there right now using this like initial like dummy implementation that we put up on the SIGs repo. I don't know that we need to keep going with our original plan to force kubeproxy to consume service import directly. Like it doesn't seem like it buys us much. It does open up some new options for flexibility, but we could always do that in the future if it's not in the spec. You know, there could be something like in up until Kubernetes 123, you know, there's dummy services, and then eventually we switch over to kubeproxy consuming service import directly. Either way, I don't think MCS consumers have a good reason to care. I'm curious what everybody else thinks.
It seems very unlikely to me based on like the state that we're in right now that kubeproxy will consume service imports or exports in the near future. I don't know if anybody agrees with that, but seems like this one has been defunct as a concept for like a while. Yeah, in my own memory.
I think we could, like, from my understanding, if I remember back when we were like meeting with SIG Network and chatting it through, like there was some openness to it, but it would be a fair amount of work. It would definitely impact release schedule, and I'm not sure we get anything out of it.
Yeah, you definitely get a linkage with the version of kubeproxy.
right, exactly. Like the, you know, in terms of functional changes right now, it doesn't seem like we get anything good, and we do get some added friction. So, you know, I'd just be inclined to keep that as an implementation detail. But I think we should be very clear that it's like whatever decisions we make should leave that open as a implementation detail. Like we shouldn't actually, I don't think we should encode the dummy service in the spec, for example, because, you know, if you wanted some new data plane, you know, that you built in your distro that consumes service import directly, or if you wanted your own patch of kubeproxy, that, like, I think we should leave that door open unless we have a good reason to close it.
Yeah, in general, I think that like it's best to defer any decision you don't have to make. That seems like one we don't have to make. So in my view, like the current setup, it seems like it's working fine.
Cool.
Yeah, and as an additional data point, Submariner consumes service imports without changing anything on kubeproxy.
Awesome.
Okay, yeah. So there you go. So let's just, I guess, drop that as a graduation item, and, you know, we can just mention a few maybe example implementations and say, implementers, you know, do what you want.
Okay.
Power to the programmer.
Yes.
Yeah, drop the graduation requirement, mention a few examples of implementations, like dummy service. If you made kubeproxy work with it, your own thing. Okay. Cool. And any other seems final. I can take that action item for sure. Moving right along. So last time we met, there's also brought up the point of should the MCS API's beta be tied to cluster ID kept beta, and etc. And big highlight here, even though it's a very small font, is that the MCS API depends on cluster ID for DNS. So while DNS is technically optional, it is pretty common. So do we think that that's grounds enough to tie their graduation to each other, is my question. And then I will bring this point up, but is there any initial feelings about that?
I think ideally, like something that's like ideally at a certain maturity level, you only depend on like your maturity level or more mature. So in that light, it seems like it should be a requirement that cluster ID is beta.
Yeah, I agree with that. Where I guess my pause was more thinking cluster ID seems like we've discussed it a long time and it's pretty simple. I guess we need to figure out the bootstrapping thing, which is also on this slide, but
Yeah.
how long do we need to stay in alpha for that? It's kind of it's kind of an interesting thing because it's right now the primary use case is MCS. So it kind of like I imagine it will kind of roll together with MCS.
Right. Yeah, I think we're having a little bit of a chicken egg problem. And I think even though, you know, we went the route of like to CRD or not to CRD and got some advice from SIG architecture, and their answer was the CRD bootstrapping project. I think since it's still kind of uncertain, then there's a feeling amongst us that like maybe we still need to see if that will be good enough for our purposes. To give the update on that, the project is moving forward. Possibly people saw there was an announcement that was CC'd to us. There's a POC pull request. There's a doc that I've linked to that I got from Nikita directly. And I also stalked even more. And there's SIG API Machinery is probably going to be talking about it at their next meeting on 5/19. So maybe we want to like inject ourselves in any or all of these things. So I think when we met 2 weeks ago, we weren't even sure if this was like really getting off the ground or not because it was still kind of like in stealth mode. But it's definitely in the public eye now. And there's, from what I'm reading, it's going to undergo like a KEP process. So, you know, we'll have plenty of opportunity for input, but that definitely means that this, you know, this project undergoes the same like governance that if that slows down cluster ID, then that slows down MCS API. So I guess we have to decide if that's valuable to us to tie them all together.
Well, I think it's valuable having like dependency on cluster ID being more mature than alpha, like what you get in exchange for like that linkage is the cost is like now they're linked. What you get in exchange for that as a consumer is that like if we take MCS to beta and cluster IDs beta, like you have a real like ability to reason about things in terms of like the maturity levels that you would expect. If we take MCS to beta and we say cluster ID is alpha and there's some like breaking change to cluster ID, that will ripple up potentially into your view as someone that like only cares about MCS, and like that is the reason why you want to depend on things that are your maturity level or later, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah, I think if we're going to depend on cluster ID, they have to be locked together. At the same time, I think we need cluster ID graduation criteria to have an implementation that uses it or some kind of use case, right? So I'm actually wondering if we shouldn't just like tightly couple both of them and maybe I don't know about merging the KEP, but almost because I don't know how we like what a beta cluster ID without any consumers would mean anyway. So
Mhm.
We should probably just couple them together.
It does seem like in this light, like they are at this point one thing, where we think that cluster ID will have like use outside of the boundary that it's sort of like inside right now. But like if we combine them, it does get simpler to reason about the whole thing, I think.
Yeah. And it also seems like, and anyone jump in if there's other things I'm missing here, but really the big blocker for cluster ID going even beta is probably just figuring out deployment. So maybe we should just check in after we see what's happening with CRD bootstrapping. As I've thought about this more over the last few weeks, like at least for our current use cases, I don't know that we actually need bootstrapping. It's just given the other use cases we've outlined in the future for cluster ID, knowing that it will be possible at some point is important, but it doesn't need to exist now. Like, I don't think we need to wait for a proper bootstrapping mechanism to graduate cluster ID.
Yeah, I think the nuance in there is some of what made this came up. Like if we like were not confident about the cluster bootstrapping project, would we go all the way back to the KK question, even though we kind of finalized it on the basis of this cluster bootstrapping project? So I think that's the nuance in there, and that also opened the floor for like, oh, maybe cluster ID should chill in alpha for a while that settles, which based on this conversation then also ties MCS API to chill in alpha until cluster ID settles. So anyways, that's kind of just a rehash of what had been talked about last time. What I think I'm hearing is that they should be tied together for like the principled reasons of like what's that your maturity level shouldn't depend on things that are less mature than you. And then I think it can be sort of a separate tangent of deciding if cluster ID truly is restricted for its own, beta graduation of we can bootstrap it today, like whatever day that is. And hopefully we don't get too, caught up in it again, but that's what I'm taking away from this. If I even wrote it down, it's that, yes, we tie them to each other's beta graduation. Like I can literally put a line item in MCS API that this other KEP is at, at beta. And then I can put in cluster ID that there is a, MCS DNS implementation using cluster ID, which is like proof that there's a consumer of it. And then carry on from there.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. The more I think about this, I wouldn't want to block cluster ID on figuring out CRD bootstrapping. We know that it has to happen at some point. We don't have any tangible use cases that require it right now for cluster ID that I can remember. Like I think we want a CRD regardless, especially if we're going to couple these two together. Otherwise, MCS gets all the burden of being in KK by proxy without actually being in KK. And and I just like all of our reasons for wanting the cluster ID CRD bootstrapped in a deployment are theoretical use cases right now, which are interesting for sure, but they're still not real.
So that sounds like it sounds like you're articulating a preference for CRD, Jeremy, and like the future bootstrapping allows us, like, is additive, but fundamentally doesn't change that. Fundamentally doesn't change like the in or out a desire, right? Like it makes what we think will be the best way to do it better.
Exactly.
But it doesn't, it's not the difference between we should or should not do it.
Right. And I mean, also some of this is, I've been chatting about this kind of thing with like Daniel Smith, and it, at some point there will be like lots of people need CRD bootstrapping. We will solve it. This doesn't need to be the only driver. I think we should keep following up though. Like if we don't block up CRD bootstrapping, we should still definitely be looking for it and do what we can to help make it happen.
Right. Yeah, and I think what Jeremy is saying aligns with what the message I got from SIG architecture when we went there too. So, all right, well, I can take these, and then I think the meta point, the relevant point for beta blockers is, as I said before, that they depend on each other. And then there also needs to be a, like keep following up with cluster bootstrapping project, and that we should stay involved because we are a use case basically, and we should make sure that projects about that keep going forward and that our needs are at least known. So I agree with that. I can definitely be a part of that too.
Yep. And it provides like an example use case to like test CRD bootstrapping with.
Right. Yeah, I was happy to see in the announcement too, we were mentioned explicitly as a use case. So we're definitely in the minds, and then we can keep hanging out there.
That's great.
Cool. All right, I'm going to move from this one to the finalizing it. Yes, we tie them to each other. I don't think we structurally will combine the caps unless people think that's worth it. I'm going to leave them separate for now.
Cool, that works.
Okay, cool. And then there were 3 related SIG network projects that are happening that we think, either from conversations I've eavesdropped on or because they're mentioned in the MCS API cap, that we need to interface with somehow. Like we need to do the things that they do, but at the multi-cluster level. So I did a little jump into them. Some of this might be old to some of you, but I will just rehash a little bit and also update on where they are. And then what I really want to know is figuring out the specifics of what we're doing about them a beta blocker or not. And if so, I'll put more energy towards it now. So the 3 are service topology, API, dual stack, and terminating endpoint. So I'm going to do them in that order. Okay, so service topology API revamp. The current hotness on this is KEP 2433 topology aware hints, which has this release schedule. And see, it seeks there. It looks like there were some other like abandoned KEPs that tried to handle this like in a broader, like more configurable way. But this one is kind of like the latest iteration, which seeks to do a smaller portion, I guess, of what has been historically discussed, specifically to avoid cross-zone routing when in-zone would suffice for endpoint slices and Kubernetes clusters that are deployed in multiple zones. So there's some details here about how it's suggested in the KEP to work, that the endpoint controller is going to like have endpoint slices know where their pods are because the nodes of those pods know their zone annotation. And then there's this other like auto way to determine which zone should be aligned with which endpoint in the endpoint slice based on being in the same zone based on that same node annotation, and also proportion of CPU cores in the zone to try and like not overload any individual zone. And then there's some work going on to make Kube proxy consume all of this information to filter out IPs it shouldn't route to for a given service request based on the hints. So this
I've been following this one for a while, and I just think we need a plan. Like, I don't think we need like tight integration or anything. And my read would really just
Like
be that
like
an
a
MCS implementation
more detailed
becomes-
analysis now for beta purposes? Is this enough information to help advise on that?
Sounds like we got a little bit of latency in there.
I think can everyone hear me? My audio did cack out on me.
I heard you, Jeremy. Laura was the one who cut
Like
out
to
for
me, it seems that this endpoint controller propagating this information up from this zone annotation is, I guess, works as described on the box. But then the question of how these hints get used from a multi-cluster perspective, I guess I don't feel as confident about.
My take on this has been that the MCS implementation becomes the endpoint controller for multi-cluster endpoints and can use hints as needed. And that's kind of that to me feels like the right level of vagueness.
I agree. The topology design was trying to be as loose as possible here. And in fact, Rob recently just loosened it up even a little bit more just to make sure that it isn't, oh, did we lose Laura? To make sure that it isn't too locked into what's going on. Oh. Laura, are you there? She says in chat she can't hear me. Can anybody else hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, Laura, I think it's you. So anyway, so it's supposed to be loose. I think I agree, Jeremy, with your statement before. MCS becomes the endpoint controller. If it has topology information, it can specify those in the hints, and if it doesn't, then it can not. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah. Yeah, that seems fair there, and also like we can sort out more details as that KEP evolves.
And yeah, just to be clear, it's alpha again. It's the new topology API alpha. Hopefully, this one will not stall out like the last one.
Makes sense to me. Laura, did you get any of that?
Maybe we should pause this and hit the next topic and then come back to it.
Yeah, I think that is reasonable. Gabe Rosenhaus, you're up with the next topic.
Oh boy. Cool. Hey y'all. Nice to meet you. I've kind of been lurking a little bit, but it's yeah, I'll talk now. Let me find out how to share my screen. Thanks. So gosh. I think like we're interested in this multi-cluster services stuff. I wrote an email about this, so if you've read my email, then this might just be rehashing old stuff. But I'd love to get people's takes in more detail and other information. So this thing about mutual trust and shared ownership amongst clusters, I'm concerned is so narrow as to make this effort, which is very appealing to me, like not quite usable for some of the use cases that my employer has in mind. And so the use case that we are pretty interested in is like not requiring very much trust, but still letting you share services. So like to be super, I don't know, make an example, you got 3 clusters that have different apps on them, run by different teams, and you have a 4th cluster that runs a service, and the admins of those clusters are different people who don't trust each other to not screw up their clusters or to do things that would hurt each other. And so like you might have some sort of security expectations or requirements from the administrators of those independent clusters. Like the ones who are importing would be like, I only want to import from that one, not from the other people who are importing from it. And I only want that one namespace. Don't give me all the other stuff that's on that cluster. I don't want my cluster's namespaces filled up with services from over there. And then the admin of the cluster that's sharing services might say, only export and don't pull anything into my cluster, only export from this one namespace that is supposed to be shared. And so these kinds of requirements are just like, this is not what a cluster set has been defined to be. But like service export is still super valuable to the folks who are trying to share the service. And like, I've talked with people about this and they're like, yeah, I would totally just drop a service export into my application manifest. And I don't really want to have to care about what the trust environment is between the cluster that I happen to be deploying into and where my consumers are. That's something that maybe is managed beyond my team's control or interest. So I've been like looking at like possible implementations of this. I hacked up something myself, but then people pointed at me at this other project called Scupper, which I don't really know anything about, but it looks really cool. They lets you link up namespaces with each other, like namespace by namespace across clusters, and then pull services across. So I opened an issue there and it was like, hey, this looks like you could just implement service export. And they're like, yeah, but we wouldn't really be compliant with the KEP because the KEP says service export means this one thing, which is automatically share with all the other clusters in this cluster set. And that might result in mismatched expectations. And that was sort of a similar sentiment that I was getting from people internally who we might want to build on this thing. So I guess like kind of my question is like, can cluster set be optional? How do people feel about that?
Well, so what, I guess an optional cluster set to me just seems like a cluster set of one. Like,
right. Yeah.
And that, so part of the high trust thing is to me has been, and I think we are all open to discussing differences, but it's been that, like, as you said, if it's not to everyone, then somebody needs to handle who can talk to who, right? So that service export, I can just throw it in my manifest and export a service, but if it's not going to everybody, somebody needs to create the barriers.
Yeah.
So talking a lot with SIG Network, one of the ideas that we've had here is that this is a really good use for the gateway API. So maybe you've got a bunch of cluster sets of one, but you can define gateways to point to exported services and consume them that way. Because when you're, if you don't have a cluster set, then like to some degree, it seems like you lose some of the Kubernetes nativeness of it. And you really just want an easy way to expose a service to other clusters. But maybe, if you were doing like the bare bones MCS implementation on a flat network, for example, that kind of already requires some degree of trust. So just making like, you could use a service, you could use like a cluster set with holes poked in it to, export all the endpoints from one cluster to another and do kube proxy based networking for that service between clusters. But if trust is the issue, it seems like maybe you already don't have a flat network and you probably also want some kind of gateway between those clusters.
Yeah, but I think that's all implementation details, right? From the perspective of the team that owns, the person who owns the service, they just want to say, I've got the services in this cluster. Now I want to share it. And like maybe under the hood, there's a controller that's, setting up, programming the gateway, but writing a gateway TLS route or whatever the thing is.
Right. But I guess, but that's kind of the way that at least the way I've been envisioning how this would work today is like, you could just have service exports and some controller creates gateway resources as necessary or something like that. But somebody still needs to do that. Like, I don't think if you're not going to have a flat, then service export by itself isn't enough. Like if it's not going to export to everybody, you still need someone to define the walls.
Yeah, and I think that's true for the cluster set definitions too, right? Someone has to say like these clusters belong to a cluster set.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's so I can see it in both dimensions of choosing to express this as gateways or even as load balancers, right? Like historically, the way you share stuff between two clusters is expose it of a type load balancer with some annotation to the implementation that says internal, and then you get a local load balancer that lets you bring traffic in and out, where load balancer is completely loosely defined, right? It might be a VIP or it might be an actual proxy. So gateway is an extension of that, which is more powerful and flexible. But looking at it from an MCS point of view, it seems, at least at first, it seems reasonable that the implementation is governed by policy. So if you step back and you say, this is in fact an implementation of MCS, but my implementation includes policies like don't export this to that, do export this to that, right? And that seems, it sounds funny to say, strictly additive because the result is subtractive, right? You add policy and subtract results. And it seems to me like that should be allowed. I mean, when we wrote the MCS semantic descriptions, we wanted, I think, to be as loose as we could and allow implementations to be creative for exactly this sort of reason, right? So, I mean, backing up, it seems completely reasonable to take a generic MCS implementation and say, but I want a specific deny list, right? And I want, this cluster is not allowed to export that namespace. I don't care what the cluster says, it's just not allowed, right? And if it puts a service export there, I'm just going to ignore it. This just seems like that taken to a more complete conclusion.
Right. I mean, you could even have policy that just doesn't allow rights to service exports in those namespaces in clusters that shouldn't export. And maybe your exporting cluster that should only export a service and not consume any only has the namespace that exports. It doesn't have the other namespaces. Those services can't be imported.
So, I mean, my take is, I think you're legit. I think maybe we need to make sure the specs that we've written are expansive enough that they explicitly call out that this is allowed, or at least that they don't imply that it's not, right? Because I mean, this is the truth of our industry, right? We accumulate policy over time, and so it seems like it should be legitimate to me.
Yeah, I think the only thing we'd want to avoid, which doesn't seem like it showed up in your list at all, is like you have basically two copies of the same service, each exported to a subset of clusters, but we want those clusters to be in the same cluster set. Like that's that with our definition of cluster set, we've just been trying to avoid the situation where where basically you need to go do a huge amount of lookup to understand who exports to what, because you can't inspect any given cluster and understand its interactions with the others. So if you go ahead, Tim.
Sorry, let me ask a clarifying question for Gabe. If you have two clusters and they don't trust each other, what prevents them both from having the same namespace and trying both to export it?
Right. And so that is like I think the solution that we're thinking about, that's a thing that some multi-cluster admin who's yet a third party we haven't talked about yet has made the determination that like, I'm going to allow those two people to talk to each other. Or maybe those two cluster admins have just emailed each other and said, hey, we want to share services. Let's make sure we dedupe our namespaces before we try to share. Or they say, actually, we do want to share across these namespaces. Like we're intentionally lining them up so they have the same name, so everything else works for us. But there's like some coordination that happens at that moment, and then it's intentional.
Okay, so that's I think that was the really important part, is that it is intentional. Either you're intentionally making them the same, or you have to go out of your way to make them not the same in order to not collide here. And in my head, I have this vision of a multi-cluster switchboard, where a patch panel where I'm pulling wires from this cluster to that cluster and this cluster to the broadcast hub, and okay. I mean, that seems like it should be allowable to me. are there specific, so maybe the action item here then is we should propose specific wording changes to what's written.
Okay. Yeah, I think like the way I see it is cluster set is a really useful, simple model for talking about how services could be shared. And it might be the inspiration for certain MCS controllers, but it doesn't have to be part of the definition of the semantics of service export and service import. Those things can be decoupled from the definition of cluster set. Or maybe we frame it as sharing between cluster sets has these semantics that are looser.
Sure. Yeah, I've certainly heard from other folks that they like the idea of sameness, but they want some specific controls to say, you know what, the foo system namespace is never sameness. It's never the same. It's always a cluster vertical thing, and I want to control that at a higher level.
I think we did actually spell that out in the sameness position statement, Doc. Like these are never the same is kind of a sameness. I think the only thing we want to avoid is that these are the same sometimes and not others. Like that's when it starts getting hard to reason about.
Right. We don't want two distinct foo groups that then ever intersect.
But namespace bar is always cluster local is a totally reasonable statement to make, I think.
So one thing that I'd be curious about is like, Gabe, you mentioned the Scupper project. Do you think, like in your estimation, does this conversation potentially like impact the feeling that one of the Scupper maintainers expressed about not wanting to implement the KEP? Like sort of as different but related to this whole conversation. I wonder if like we can share future wording changes with that audience to see, would this affect your decision about whether to implement?
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm not close to them, but I'm happy to do that. Like it's pretty, I would like to, if folks are open to it, I'm happy to like try to draft some wording changes and then circulate them here. And then if we're all good with it, I can circulate it outside of here. And okay, cool. I did want to poke, I hope I'm not like making my case harder here, but I wanted to poke a little bit about this, like two different namespaces with the same thing that are not overlapping question, and see if, I just want to make sure that my mental model of it is consistent. So how can let me share my screen one more time. Here's a picture that maybe terrifies people. Or maybe you're like, no, that's fine.
So, I mean, I'm not afraid of any boxes. Like
it's that, I think that the top two boxes are scary. The foo, because now like you don't really like import only from cluster 2, import only from cluster 3. Does make things a lot harder to reason about. And then so the question is, are these actually foo, or is it foo 1 and foo 2?
So like if bar wasn't here, we would just say these were two different cluster sets and they never interact.
Right.
But the fact that there's something that stretches across them then makes this, yeah. So help me understand, like, what's the,
so then it becomes harder to reason about what foo is and who it talks to, I guess. So like, why would you do this? And, you know, obvious examples I can come up with are that, you know, we have like a US deployment and a Europe deployment, and I don't want chatter between the two. But then are these really still foo, or is it foo US and foo Europe? Right? Like, I guess, why are the namespaces still the same if I actually care about this distinction?
So the namespaces are the same because the cluster admins can do whatever they want because they're cluster admins, and like we don't have control over that.
Right. So, but I mean, could there be policy when you're handing these out? I guess like cluster admin is an extremely privileged role, right? So if you've got a bunch of cluster admins and they're just like, and they can make whatever namespaces they want, then it gets harder. Identity gets a lot harder to reason about, because now it's just everybody has like it to me. And please push back on this, but it feels like the result is that everybody just kind of has to be on their best behavior. If there's no if there can't be policy in place to say don't just make your own foo namespace. Like you do need to coordinate about what the identity is.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking that's the problem of the cluster admins that they're taking on when they choose to sort of federate or share with other clusters. And if maybe your thing is we're giving them a foot gun and it's better that we don't.
Yeah, or just tell them you get all of the you're my European cluster admin, so include Europe in your namespaces or something like that. Maybe a better system.
Yeah, I just don't know if I think there are cases where we want to empower really just cluster admins who don't have a common authority that they work under to share with each other. And so they may have pre-existing namespaces that collide, and telling them to rename namespaces on existing clusters could be costly for them.
So on the one hand, service export and service import describes a mechanism, right? And how you choose to use that mechanism is a different conversation. So one could reasonably write their own implementation that does this, right? And you're within your rights. It's all free software. Go nuts, right? Is this a model that I'm super comfortable about telling everybody to do? Less so, because I think it is a little bit complicated to reason about, but I can sort of make up stories about why you would end up in that situation. And I don't think there's a technical reason why you can't implement it that way, right? Again, if you zoom out, it's just policy. You're saying the switchboard doesn't allow connections between, I lost your colors, but between the things that are not connected, right? I'm not sure if we want to go as far as saying this is a common pattern and all implementations should be able to express it yet. If it turns out that this is something that everybody needs to do, maybe we need to actually invest more into visibility and figuring it out. The service import, service export API, because it's very cluster centric, any errors will be propagated down, presumably propagated down to the correct clusters, right? There's no global control plane that is mandated that has to be aware of this, right? Now, I don't particularly want to write this control plane for what you just drew, but if you want to do that, I mean, I wouldn't say you're terribly wrong. I would say it seems a little unfortunate that the namespaces are the same, and I would perhaps in the future endeavor to coordinate better.
Yeah, to me, there's nothing wrong with the model that you described, but if we put it in the standard, then what it basically says is anyone who wants to build on MCS needs to be aware that namespaces can mean whatever you want.
Yeah, I'm certainly not trying to say that. I wanted to, I think I might want to allow implementations to do this, but we don't have to, I don't want to tell them that it's prohibited, or I'm trying to figure out if there are reasons why we would want to prohibit it, other than it's scary if you're trying to do a multi-cluster global control plane thing. But if we're saying this is just the natural result of clusters independently federating with one another because the cluster admins are choosing to do so, I'm trying to figure out if that just sort of happens organically.
Probably what we need is to go back and look at the words of what we've written and make sure that those places where we say all clusters, that we add a footnote. This is modulo policy, right? Because the implementations are allowed to do whatever they want with policy, really. And I think that's a good thing, right? At first, it'll be a little bit painful while there are 10 different implementations and people figure out what are the sticky features, but eventually that'll converge.
Yeah, the situation you described will probably just work fine if you have your implementation carve up clusters, and people consuming it will probably get the right experience. But I like the modulo policy thing. We can add a note saying this is how it's going to work, and maybe it doesn't in your implementation, so please read the fine print.
This is an API that describes the willingness to publish and the active importing. Exactly how the patch panel between your clusters looks is an implementation detail. And we should be careful. I love writing specware, but we should be careful not to make it super precise, but we should also not make it so loose that we can't really think about it. What I want to avoid is that we end up producing a 50-page document with examples of crazy things that you could do, even if we don't think they're good ideas.
Yeah, that sounds.
Yeah, I do think that like the use case that you bring up, like the thing that I think is like both progress and like it's a little bit of a complication because it's sort of outside the conceptual framing of cluster set. Like to me, the element that represents that is that it seems like this might be an environment where like, you know, there are previously established clusters that were created. Like, I don't want to, you know, project anything onto this situation, but like, here's maybe another one that maybe has some parallels. It's like in my organization, use of Kubernetes like started out as like shadow IT, and maybe different departments like built their own sets of built their own X, Y, and Z clusters, and now like they're reaching a point where they want to do some service sharing, but they already have things arranged in such a way that like it's not a proper cluster set due to namespace name collisions that are like in different functional areas. So I think it's something that we should pay attention to see like if, you know, in this case, I think we have found some like, you know, semantic things about the wording that was used that maybe like construe something that was unintended, but like as a group, let's pay attention to this, like as we get more examples of people wanting to use cluster set, because we have been sort of like, you know, I don't want to say specware in a pejorative sense, but like it's really good to get the input from like you have a real use case that doesn't factor cleanly into what we've done so far. So we should all be paying attention to that as we get more folks joining that like have pre-existing environments that don't happen to line up with cluster set or something else about what we've decided.
Right. I also like in this specific use case, like, again, I don't see anything really wrong with it, but just thinking about a complication, like what if you have a few services across namespaces that are kind of co-deployed? Now it's kind of on the switchboard operator to make sure that they draw the same lines around all those namespaces. Otherwise you might get some strange behavior. So that's the kind of thing that like that opens up that otherwise wouldn't have been an issue, but is also solvable. So
yeah, I don't see, like, I don't want to write the switchboard application. It sounds like hell. But I see how it's a useful thing. And in fact, I can go even a step further. We explicitly left room in the various specs for subsetting, for the idea that the controller could choose not to propagate all endpoints to all clusters, right? This is just kind of a variant of very specific subsetting, if you squint.
Steven's hand is up. Go ahead, Steven.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there's, if there's isn't more of a problem with the second line and the diagrams, the one where there are 4 clusters in the cluster set. 3 of them import a given service, and the service that's exported isn't available in the 4th one, because to me it seems that changes the namespace sameness from the consumer's perspective, which might be more significant. Because like in the top line, the service is different, and there's a subset. There are 2 subsets that don't talk to each other, but any consuming service that can assume that the service is available in the other namespace, in foo or wherever it was, it just might not. The implementation of the service might be different, but it will get the service. Whereas in the second line, services in the first cluster, they can't expect that the service is available there. Well, or they might because of namespace sameness, and they're in the cluster set, but it's just not there.
Yeah, that is actually, you're right. That's kind of a bigger flag, because the in the first case, the two namespaces, as Tim said, we built room for subsetting. So one option is that they are actually the same service, but the implementation only ever provides clusters 3 and 4 each other's endpoints, and clusters 1 and 2 each other's endpoints, and just never lets endpoints cross between that subset. The consumer doesn't care; they just get a service. Where those endpoints are is up to the implementation. But yeah, the next line, like I think currently recommended way to do this would be don't allow bar in cluster 1. But I guess if it's unrestricted cluster admins, that becomes a hard thing to enforce, and that's where we need to have this switchboard.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there will be necessarily implementations that are very automatic, convention based, and you plug things in and they just work. And there will be implementations that are very configuration based, and some cluster admin somewhere has to go and add the name or address of your cluster to a YAML file and get it GitOps reviewed and pushed to some control system, and that's how you enable it. And probably lots and lots of steps in between, because there are very different customer bases out there who want to do different stuff, right?
Yeah, that's
Gabriel, I
closer
don't
to
know.
the use case that's motivating this. That's exactly what
Yeah,
we're talking about.
I
It's
don't know.
gross,
I don't know
but
who
it's
you,
explicit.
right. I don't know who you work for, but I'm going to guess it's a big company.
Yeah, it's VMware. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, what you just said, that's sort of like the motivating thing here is like, okay, they're going to have to talk to each other and get some addresses and credentials and share them with each other, and then they'll be in this, they'll at least have some partial trust with one another. All right, well, thanks for the feedback. This was really helpful. I'm going to go, I guess, concretely, I'm new to this contributing to KEP's process. Should I make a pull request against the KEP document with the changes I'm talking about? I know Laura has a pull request that's in flight. I don't want to like make merge conflicts with hers.
Rebase.
Okay, cool.
There we
Merging
go.
merging is part of life.
Yeah. No great way around that, but yeah, that would be a great place. Make your suggestions and we can discuss on the PR.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are out of time for this week. So Laura, I know we didn't get through everything. I hope you're back and can hear.
I am.
Awesome. Maybe we can pick up the rest of yours next week.
Yeah, no problem. And sorry if I was talking over people before when my internet was haunted. And also, if we want to take any of this offline, especially because we're in sort of like the related SIG network projects section, happy to like DM with people too.
Cool.
So, yep.
Okay, let's pick it. Let's at least give a readout of where we land on this next week, if we do land somewhere, or we can pick it back up next week.
Okay. Roger that.
All right. Thanks for coming, everybody. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you next time.
See you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Go read